Hello and welcome to Unit 4 on the Communist Manifesto. I'm releasing this unit as a free YouTube mini course, so let's run through the structure of this whole unit by mentioning each lesson in this unit. In this first lesson, we'll do a brief introduction of the manifesto, the historical context in which it was written, and we'll also focus on clearing up some common misconceptions about that historical context. In Lesson 2, we'll talk about Marx's theory of history and crisis that's implicit in the manifesto. In the third lesson, it's all about some of the political theory in this document, especially Marx's theory of the state, which is obviously of central importance to any revolution. The fourth lesson is about revolutionary Marxism in general, especially Marxism-Leninism. This is an absolutely essential lesson. Definitely don't miss this one. The fifth lesson is about evolutionary Marxism, which is the other side of revolutionary Marxism. Here we'll talk about the famous debate within socialism, reform, or revolution. The sixth lesson is about moving beyond the evolutionary-revolutionary debate. So here we go into some contemporary debates among modern Marxists, especially around this dialectical term Aufhebung, which is about how systems both preserve and transcend the previous system, the previous mode of production that they emerged out of. Finally, in the seventh lesson, we explore another modern debate in Marxism that's related to the questions of the manifesto, and that is all about degrowth communism and eco-socialism, and how we should read the manifesto in the light of the problems that environmentalism brings out. In this brief lesson, we'll just give some background information about the text and why it's so significant, as well as the historical context in which it was written. This will allow us to get our bearings and might help clear up some common misconceptions before we really get started. That's it. Enjoy. The manifesto has been called the world's most important political document. Alan Wood said that the manifesto has a historical resonance probably unsurpassed by any other single piece of secular writing from any part of the political spectrum. Which makes sense because it is very likely the second highest selling book of all time after the Bible. This might seem surprising, but there's a very good reason for this, and that is because it became a sort of Bible for the Third World Project as many countries waged revolutions of independence against their colonizers in the 20th century. This history has been detailed in Vijay Prashad's book here, Red Star Over the Third World, if you're interested. It's in the module materials. What's really striking about the history of this book for me is how young Marx and Engels were when they wrote it. Engels was 27 when he drafted the Principles of Communism, which was the precursor to the manifesto. It's written here in scribbles, and I just kind of love how that's the way that this comes to us, is through these ridiculous scratchings and scribblings on this piece of paper, and it's just had such a massive impact. Anyway, that's true about a lot of old texts, but I just wanted to show you this image here because it's fascinating to me. Marx also picked it up and he edited it when he was only 29. Pretty amazing, pretty young. So if you notice someone only quoting the manifesto, if they've only read the manifesto, they've actually got some real problems, because looking at the totality of Marxism through this short political pamphlet is kind of like looking through a prism. It's going to create some distortions and alterations that need to be parsed out systematically and understood. And that's what we're doing in this unit overall. Let me give you a picture of what this document was supposed to be and what it's all about. In 1847, the Communist League commissioned Marx and Engels to write the manifesto for the Communist Party. This was during a time of extreme political crises all over Europe, and revolutions were on the horizon. It was a pamphlet that was intended to unite the left under a unified goal of revolutionary struggle to end capitalism and monarchies wherever they existed. You might expect there to be a detailed description of a utopian society in this manifesto, right? It's what the communists are trying to manifest. But that's not what they give us here. Instead, we get a view of history as the history of class struggle. And in this light, we get a brief history of capitalism and the revolutionary role that the capitalist class has played in overturning feudalism and setting the stage for their own overthrow. So we also see how capitalism is crisis-ridden and is driven by its own inner contradictions to reach an unsustainable tipping point, just like feudalism before it. When the opportune moment inevitably arises, Marx calls on the working class to revolt and seize the centralized power of government, and then use that state power to manifest communism using the machinery of the state, but also fundamentally changing the state. We'll get into more details about that in this unit a little later. For now, let's begin. Let's do some textual hiking by reading Ellen Wood's essay on the Manifesto after 150 years. She writes, "The Communist Manifesto is just that, a manifesto. It's not a long and comprehensive scholarly study, but a public declaration of a political program, a short and dramatic statement of purpose and a call to arms, written at a time of political ferment on the eve of what turned out to be the nearest thing the world had ever seen to international revolution." It's a big deal. So, to really understand the manifesto, we have to begin by understanding a bit of the historical context in which it was written. Industrial capitalism was barely emerging at this point in Europe, and everywhere that it was, socialist resistance to it was present as well. These things co-evolved always. Socialism was always right there on the back of capitalism as it emerged. It was written on the eve of revolutionary ferment in Europe, the 1848 revolutions. We spoke about this in Unit 1, which was all about Marx's biography, so some of this should be familiar if you've taken the full course. What's key to understand is that this revolution was neither a socialist revolution against capitalism, nor was it a bourgeois revolution in the sense of the bourgeoisie liberating capitalism from its feudal constraints. A lot of people think this, but neither of these two things are true. These pan-European revolutions actually took place in countries where capitalism was not very advanced. So it couldn't have been a socialist revolution against some advanced capitalist or bourgeois state, because the bourgeoisie was not yet a coherent and fully formed capitalist class in Europe at that time. Take a look at this Ellen Wood quote here at the bottom. In fact, these revolutions were waged by scattered middle and lower classes, not a coherent proletariat. Such a coherent proletarian class only really existed in England at that time, which was the birthplace of capitalism. All this should raise questions for us, like, what was Marx talking about in the manifesto? He was seemingly calling for a communist revolution against capitalism. It's the Communist Manifesto. But this was at a time when neither the proletariat nor the bourgeoisie were fully formed, and capitalism was really in its basic beginner emerging stage. Let's read what Marx was really doing. What were his political aims for this pamphlet? We need to remember that he was writing between two pan-European revolutions. We just talked about the 1848 revolutions that came after the manifesto, that the manifesto was kind of trying to bring on accurately because something really did happen. But the first revolution we actually talked about in Unit 1 on Marx's biography, because these revolutions greatly impacted his father, like I said in the last slide. Go back to that if you want to check that out. These revolutions are the anti-monarchy revolutions, which are probably most famous for the events in 1789 France, known as the storming of the Bastille, where revolutionaries stormed the fortress and political prison. Obviously, France still celebrates Bastille Day even today. But now, let's get some more detail about this. Let's read from Marx's biographer, because he's got a quote that's really relevant. He says, Marx pressed for a democratic revolution to destroy the authoritarian Prussian monarchy. This is at the time of Marx writing the Manifesto. At the same time, he aspired to organize the working class to carry out a communist uprising against the capitalist regime he expected such a revolution to establish. In effect, Marx was proposing a double recurrence of the French Revolution, a repetition of its 1789 to 94 phase in mid-19th century Prussia, and also a workers' seizure of power at the end of the 1840s, modeled on the bourgeois seizure of power at the end of the 1780s. So Marx wanted to take advantage of the significantly high anti-monarchy sentiment in Europe at that time. But he knew that the overthrow of the monarchy would lead to a kind of liberal capitalist state such as we have around the world today. Marx's aim was basically to let capitalism destroy the monarchy, destroy feudalism, as it eventually did, but not let this revolutionary upheaval die out. And in the midst of it all, he wanted to organize the proletariat and promote their seizure of power in a second worker-led revolution. Okay? Let's do some more reading. At any rate, when Marx and Engels wrote the manifesto, they did not believe that a socialist revolution or a proletarian revolution of any kind was in the offing. They briefly hoped that the events and the failures of 1848 might lead to something more, some further longer-term development, a permanent revolution that would push beyond the bourgeois republic to proletarian rule and finally socialism. So when Marx talks about permanent revolution, which we're going to talk about a lot more in the lesson in this unit on revolutionary Marxism, you can check that out on YouTube. When Marx talks about permanent revolution, he's talking about letting the bourgeoisie destroy the monarchies, but not letting them consolidate too much power so that the workers can eventually wage their own revolution against the bourgeoisie. We'll talk more about how the concept of permanent revolution has evolved in the lesson on revolutionary Marxism in this unit. Okay, what happens after the 1848 revolutions? Well, Marx and Engels believed the revolution was going to be in Germany to overthrow feudalism as the French Revolution in 1789 overthrew their monarchy. And in fact, there were revolutions in Germany and Prussia. Marx's predictions were right in this sense. Take a look at the picture and caption on the right. They argued that since the French Revolution was a sort of scattered bourgeois revolution against the French monarchy, the communists should support the German bourgeoisie against the German feudalists. Let me say that again. The communists should support the German bourgeoisie against the German feudalists. Marx greatly admired the French for what they did in 1789. But, as I mentioned, that revolution didn't last, and the monarchy eventually came back into power, and the whole Napoleon thing happened. So, if we're interested in why that first French Revolution failed, one place to look might be how underdeveloped capitalism actually was at that time in France. In any case, in 1849, these pan-European revolutions were largely crushed, along with Marx's hopes. The reason was that the bourgeoisie are a highly counter-revolutionary force and definitely never had any intention of sharing power with the workers and let alone the communists. So eventually Marx came to argue that the working class must play an independent leading role in a proletarian revolution. We'll discuss this later in this unit when we talk about how the events of the 1871 Paris Commune changed Marx's views. Okay, now that we have some historical context about the manifesto, let's jump right into the next lesson on the theory of history and crisis in this classic pamphlet. Thanks for watching.